Welcome to This Is Not About Your Body, a body neutrality podcast where we talk about all the real shit body image issues are actually about because they're never just about the way you look. I'm your host, Jessie Nealand, and today I have with me Jenna Ingalls, who is a fat positive sewing influencer and pattern maker who goes by the name The Lady Who Lunches on Instagram. I met Jenna when we were seated next to each other at a friend's wedding recently, and she introduced me to some of the fascinating world of plus size handmade sewists. And I immediately knew that I wanted to have her on here to talk about it. So welcome, Jenna.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here with you.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna have you start with the basics, assuming that most people like me don't know anything about sewing. What exactly does it mean to be a handmade sewist?
Yeah, I mean, it means different things for different people. But for the community that I'm part of, it means that you're making clothes for yourself. And so it's part, I would say, of the slow fashion movement in a way that it's like our clothing has complicated supply chains and is made in countries we would prefer had better labor practices. And so by making your own clothing, you're taking part in the slow fashion movement and reducing some of that harmful impact. Maybe it's like extremely complicated. There's no like perfect solution to any of this, right? And it's but also if you are like me and you identify as fat, it's also part of taking control of the clothes that you put on your body, and so making clothes that fit your body the way you want them to, that you maybe can't buy in stores, probably can't buy in stores.
Yeah. So this was part of what I thought was so interesting to hear your experience in this particular community, because I think most people who are listening to my podcast are probably going to be at least peripherally aware of like sizeism, weight stigma, issues with accessibility. But we would most often probably think of that as like, okay, so people in fat bodies have a harder time finding clothes that fit. Um, but it's actually more complex than that. So I would love to hear you talk about why so many people in bigger bodies are turning to make their own clothes, like what they're facing, what issues are coming up for them, uh, that makes it harder for them to get the clothes or find the or afford the clothes that they want.
Yeah, I mean, it's really complicated, as I'm sure like your listeners all know. It's at the intersection of so many different forms of oppression. And so the main thing is, we're like, oh, this company's not making clothes in my size. Like they're discriminating against me. They don't want my money for whatever reason. Maybe it's because they hate fat people, or they don't want to see fat people in their clothes, or they're just like, they wear clothes. Or like whatever reason it is. And it's far more complex than that when you look at it from like a technical standpoint, because the reality of it is people who make clothing and like make the patterns that they use to make the clothing from are not trained to make clothes for fat bodies. And so the knowledge set doesn't exist in formal training. And so you see this trickle down into like the plus size sewing community as well, that, there's pattern makers who are like, I just decided that we're going to make clothes for all bodies. We're going to be inclusive. Here, fat sewists, here's a pair of pants I would love you to make. They should fit you. And then you make them and you're like, that is not how a crotch fits. Like that's just not, like, my body is not that shape. And so there's just a lack of like real knowledge about the differences that you need when you're making clothing for a fat body. And that happens at like an institutional level.
So could you define for us what a pattern is and what its role in sewing or manufacturing clothing is, how that works?
Yeah. So typically when you're making clothing, there are two ways to do it. So if you're making like a couture dress for yourself, or you're like making your, I don't know, Dior, Chanel, whatever, and it's for a person, they might do like, they have a mannequin and they drape the fabric on and they pin it and then they sew it into that form. That's how you make like one-off patterns. But when you're making a pattern that's mass produced, whether it's like at a home sewist level, or if you're like a large company creating ready to wear clothing, what you do is you have a two-dimensional pattern. So it's pieces of paper that are cut out into different shapes, and you sew them up and it turns into clothing. And so you're translating a 3D body into a 2D form. And so this is why it gets more complicated with like a plus size body, because there's like more curves to fit around and you're using a two-dimensional form to do that. And so that's what's involved, like in the, and then so you take this, right? You cut out your fabric, you sew it up according to whatever instructions you give that
Yeah.
are given to you, or you follow your own intuition. And then you have hopefully a wearable garment.
So, what are the issues or what are people learning if they are going to go into like fashion or even just making clothes at home? What is the general thing that you would learn about patterns or how to make patterns?
So the main thing is, right, that everyone chooses like a standard size that they establish. So say, so what it would be today is like probably, like a size 8. That's the size that we start with. And I'm going to make 3 sizes smaller and 3 sizes larger from that. And I'm going to use like proportional grading. So everything increases by 1 centimeter. Like, I'm going to add 1 centimeter to the width and 1 centimeter to the height. But my arms are not like 10 inches longer than everyone's. So this is what happens when you start with like, it just gets more and more exaggerated and awful unless you're
Mm,
doing like a different block for all of those different sizes. And so what happens when we see like we're doing size expansion, right? We're going to have clothing for people in sizes we've never made before. Often they fall into this trap of making clothing that they think should fit a body, but they don't actually fit a body. Like, because they're not taking into account, like my neck can only be so big. It's not going to
right.
just keep getting bigger and bigger. And what's a crew neck in a size 8 is suddenly like, a wide neck in a size 24. And you're like, that's not the same
Uh,
experience of the garment. And you're not taking into account like how the actual body is. And so it is extremely labor intensive if you're going to do like some big size expansion like that, because you need to have 2 different fit blocks at a minimum, maybe more, to accommodate for how bodies change and as they get larger.
so what would you have to learn, like in the education process? What would you have to know? How to make multiple scalable blocks across the spectrum, or is it a completely different designing approach?
I don't think it's a completely different design approach. I think it's like creating different blocks, but also just bringing fat bodies into like the world with you, right? Like if you're,
It's so simple.
I mean, you have to like have real people that you put these clothes on, right?
Yeah.
And so what often happens, like I've seen a few times with sewing patterns that are released, they'll release like a sewing pattern and you're like, did a real person try this on? And the designer like, oh, I don't know anyone who wears this size clothing. You're like, oh, you have no fat
Uh-huh.
friends. I see.
Mm,
That's the
mhm.
problem. Find one. Like,
Yeah.
and,
Pay one.
yeah. And then you
Interview
can
them, have
see.
them try it on.
Like I do a lot of pattern testing with pattern designers, and so they'll say, I created this new pattern. I'm really looking for somebody with these measurements, to sew it.
Yeah.
And I sew really quickly, and so so I'll say if I like the design, I'll volunteer to sew it. And then one time it was a pair of pants, and I was like, I don't like I don't think this is a my body issue. Like the crotch is like 6 inches too small. This is not a my body issue. This
Whoa.
is a your pattern issue. And there's a lot of defensiveness when you call out something like that. Cause it's a really big error, right? Like if it were like an inch, I could be like, yeah,
Of
maybe I have
course.
like,
Yeah.
my body, everybody's weird.
Yeah.
Maybe I have like, I need more space in my crotch than other people do. But but when it's that big, you're like, I think you have a fundamental misunderstanding of like what's happening in my body
Right.
if you think this is like how patterns are. And that's actually my pet peeve when I see pants like ready to wear brands that have like it's almost like gaslighting. Like the worst offender in my mind. I don't know if you know them, like Big Bud Press. Um,
No.
they're like a slow fashion brand and they're very
Mm.
size inclusive. But when you look at the way the pants fit somebody who's like a size 6 versus a size 20 or 24, you're like, I'm sorry, one of those crotches fits better than the other. And I feel like you're gaslighting me into telling me like this is how pants are supposed to fit because they are not supposed to
Hmm.
fit that way.
So would you say that even for a brand like that who's sort of gone out with the intention of being inclusive,
Oh,
they're
and they own
still
it. They
not?
hire like beautiful models who are like amazing, wearing these poorly fitting clothing.
Oh no.
And you're like, wait, are we all it's like the emperor's new clothes. Like, does everyone
Right.
see what I see here?
Huh. Okay. So that actually just occurred to me. Obviously everybody's bodies are different, right? Our
Yeah.
ratios, our proportions, it's always going to be different, but the less flesh you have, probably the less variance, right? The bigger the body, there's probably more variance in how those proportions and ratios are going to look. So that I think is partly what I was sort of asking, like, is it a different design approach? If maybe not to the pattern making, then certainly to the idea of like testing, trialing, getting feedback from real humans. And, it does seem like at that point it has to be a bit of a social commitment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to know, right, where the so there is like, with body positivity, it's like anyone can wear anything. And like there is and like look great wearing it and feel confident, but there's a difference between like something that just fits poorly and thinking like somebody's being fat phobic by saying like those pants really don't fit you. Um, like it's so that's where I think, and so that's like the pushback that a lot of people give, like, I think we think our model is beautiful. And I'm like, I don't think your
Mm.
model is not beautiful. Like they're great, they're awesome.
Oh,
You just
yeah.
put them in clothing that does not fit them. Um,
Ooh, so it's kind of hard to be like, have a critical mindset or critique someone who's trying to be inclusive and sort of body positive because they can just get away with being like, it fits however it
or
fits.
like, how could you say that about our model? Like it was not
Oh
about the model.
gosh.
It was
Yeah.
really just about the clothes you put her in.
Ooh,
Um,
interesting.
and that I think is the thing for me, that by sewing most of my own clothing, that I've gotten away from. Like, before I sewed my own clothes, I'd go to the store and I'd go in the dressing room, right? You try on your clothes. And when in those moments, right, when something doesn't fit the way you want it to, or like it doesn't fit at all, you think, God, what is wrong with my body? Like, why can't I
Hmm.
find something that works for me? And when you're the one making it, for me at least, it's no longer what is wrong with my body. It's like, what is wrong with this pattern? Because
Oh,
it's not
yeah.
like, and that flip is so empowering.
Ooh, I love that. How long have you been making your own clothes? Has this been like a lifetime?
On and off. I like when I was in high school. I'm 35, and so when I was in high school, right, there was a lot of like low-rise jeans and clothes that were like not gonna fit me in any kind of world.
Uh-huh.
And so I used to sew a lot of like dresses on my own. And then I picked it up again maybe like 10 years ago when I was in grad school as a good like stress reliever. And then just it's become like a more integrated part of my life over the years.
It's really cool to imagine that the perspective shift once you're making the clothes and sort of seeing behind the scenes. It's almost like we give clothes like a completely inappropriate amount of authority over something. When you buy them in the store, you're like, well, if it's selling, then clearly I'm the problem.
Mhm.
Um, I could imagine that being really cool to be like, this is not a me problem because I made it and this is not how bodies work.
No, yeah, you're just like, oh yeah, this was not made for me. Like this is not
Yeah.
like there's nothing wrong with my body because other things fit me and I make them successfully and I know how to do it. Like
Yeah.
they didn't, this just isn't for me. And it's
So,
a great feeling.
oh, I love that. Has it impacted your own body image?
Oh, totally.
You want to say more about that? You don't have to.
I mean, I I'm someone who doesn't see any point in like getting hung up on like my body. I've never seen like any point in getting hung up on it. But there were like obviously things I didn't like about my body in my in my
Yeah.
life. Um and I remember once I had a friend who was sharing with me some like body image issues, that she had. And she said something to the extent like, oh, I never see you having any of those, Jenna. And I was like, those totally exist. I just don't like see any point in talking about them. Like who wants to hear me talk about them? But they've definitely dissipated. Like something that always happened was like you try on a shirt and it fits everywhere except your upper arms. And you're like, oh my
Mm,
God, my arms, like, what is wrong with my
yeah.
arms? Like, are they just like too big? Is it some problem? But when you make your own clothes and that, you're like, well, I just have like bigger arms. And so I'm going to make everything a half inch bigger when I make it. And then, oh my
Right.
gosh, the shirt fits perfectly.
Oh, that is so cool. I don't personally feel that I will ever tackle sewing. It's something that I just cannot imagine for myself, but I have so often wished I could change the fit of clothing for that exact reason. Like, I love everything about this, but apparently it wasn't made for XYZ. And like, how wonderful of a feeling that must be to be like, yeah, I just do it the way that it fits
Yeah.
from the jump. So one thing that I know, representation is an issue in the fashion industry in a lot of ways, like all the way through all of the levels. And one of the things I hear people complain about is like lack of representation in clothing. And you mentioned this is true in patterns too, for like tall people or shorter, petite people. And obviously, those are, valid complaints in that everybody wants clothes that fit them. But because of the scaling issue with the patterns, I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the difference between that kind of complaint and the issues facing fat people when it comes to patterns and clothes.
Yeah, this is super common. Unfortunately, when there's a lack of size expansion, or there is size expansion that happens in patterns, and or you're calling it out. So recently there's been there are waves, right, where people are realizing, hey, wait a second, like they said they were going to, make patterns to fit me. What happened to that?
Mm,
Like, did they forget? Is that still happening?
yeah.
Um, and you often have people in these moments be like, I know I can never get patterns that fit me at 5'2". Like, where are all the short
Hmm.
people? Everyone's not 5'7". Um, and the thing is that sure, you experience discrimination maybe if you're like shorter. I have an aunt who's like very short, and people are always like, I don't know, patting her head and doing things that are really mean. Um, but she can buy
Sure.
clothes, and
Yeah.
it's like they can be hemmed or altered. And if you're also sewing your own clothing, like you can take some length out. It's a pretty simple adjustment to take some length out. But if there's a pattern and it stops at a size 14 and you're a size 20, you need to expand that in so many different ways, and it gets more and more
Mm,
distorted. And so there's a fact that like you are being actively discriminated against in your daily life in like myriad ways, and now you're being told like, well, can't you just adjust it? Like it's a massively different adjustment that you're
yeah.
requesting somebody make on their own, and it's a different just type of discrimination that people are experiencing.
Yeah. So in the sewing community, like, what do people do? Well, how does the, fat positive sewing community address it?
There are a couple different ways it happens. So I'll say that there are two different types of sewing patterns that exist. So there's like the sewing pattern that maybe if you've been to like a big craft store like Joann's or Michael's, you've seen, right? And they're always on
Hmm.
sale for like $2. And you go through like the folders, and those are extremely size limited. They usually only go up to
Mm,
like a 48-inch hip. And those companies are collectively called the Big Four, and they're the ones that have been producing
okay.
patterns for years and for years. And they seem to have little to no interest in being size inclusive.
Right.
Um, and so maybe 15, 20 years ago, there was a movement of indie pattern makers who came out with patterns you could buy online and you could download them. And they had some of the similar issues from the start of being size inclusive, but as a general rule, they're much more size inclusive, especially when you're comparing against like what you can buy physically in
Yeah.
stores generally. Um, and so there was a big movement maybe 4 years ago to call out the companies that weren't being size inclusive and say, like, what's your plan? Because I'm not
Yeah.
going to buy any more of your patterns, and I'm not going to post the ones that I've already bought
Mm,
on social media unless like you're going to tell me what your commitment is to being size inclusive. Um,
yeah.
and so personally, I try to do that. Like I try to only buy patterns that are size inclusive. And generally that's considered like up to a 60-inch hip. There's been some push lately that it should go up to a 70-inch hip. And then truly only companies are size inclusive if they say, if you are too small to fit our pattern, let us know and we will like grade it to be big enough for you. And so there are
Oh,
two companies that I know of that do that.
wow. So, I mean, basically, you get to be ethical in the choices that you make, but that just limits you even further.
It does. And it is sometimes frustrating. I'm like right on the
Sure.
cusp. I'm small fat. I'm right on the cusp of being able to fit into a lot of things. And so there's a moment where it's like, I want, so if you go into like a hashtag for a pattern, and all you see are thin bodies, and it's a pattern that goes up to a larger size, like, do I make that so that there's representation? Like people can see, here is a fat body
Interesting.
wearing this pattern. Or do I continue to let it be like only one that you see thin people in?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really interesting ethical dilemma. Like representation of the looks that start to break the rules and sort of show what it looks like on bigger bodies versus spending the money on the companies who aren't inclusive.
Yeah, and there's a big and I'm like, I'm not perfect, right? Like there are moments where I'm like, I'm going to a wedding and I need like a certain dress that I have in my
Sure.
mind that I want to wear, and here's this pattern and I can just fit into it. Like, do I make it to show
Yeah.
like this is what it looks like on a fat body? Or, do I double down on my principles and
Right.
find
Oh
something
man.
different? There's never like a perfect solution, but
Right. So if someone was to buy a sort of straight size pattern
mhm.
and make the adjustments themselves, how difficult is that for someone who's just like a hobbyist? Is it something that's like possible but time consuming and annoying, or is it like literally not possible for most people?
It is possible and time consuming and annoying, and it will require a few books probably that you may or may not be able to check out from your local library,
Okay.
that tell you how to do
So it's
it.
pretty involved.
It's very involved. And there are some
Yeah.
people who do it, especially who are interested in like vintage sewing,
Mm,
because vintage patterns are a thing and they're even more size limited than
sure.
contemporary ones. And so there are people who are
Yeah.
very into like, vintage sewing, and they'll grade up multiple sizes. But
Yeah.
it's very complex to do.
Okay. So some of what you were saying about like the representation thing and like the sort of intended to be really connective kind of comments like, "Oh, I totally get what you mean. I feel the same way because 'cause I'm
Mhm.
a petite." Um, it reminds me of the body positivity movement's earlier days, like maybe 10, 15 years ago, where basically, like, thin women were not introduced yet to the concept of body privilege, and so they would say things like, "If I can do it, you can too," with absolutely no acknowledgement that the lived experience of someone in a bigger body might be different, like fundamentally that they face different obstacles and marginalization. And it ended up being really, really problematic and harmful. And I think it's gotten better, but it sort of depends on where you are on the internet. Um, but do you experience that inside the sewing community? Is it like a lack of body privilege awareness?
A little bit. There is so part of like what is very great about the like the Instagram sewing community in particular is that you can find somebody who has a very similar body to you. Like,
Mm.
very similar measurements, and you can see like, and I have a lot of people reach out to me and say this like, I'm your measurement twin. And so I love when you make something, Jenna,
Oh,
because
that's
I
fun.
know like how
Yeah.
it's going to fit me or what adjustments I need to make based on the measurements you made. And it's super valuable to find those people, but like,
Yeah.
how do you find them, right? And so there was a couple years ago like a measurements movement where you'd put your measurements like
Huh.
in your handle, or you would use your measurements in a hashtag so people could find like their twins,
Huh.
and use it kind of like as a fitting buddy. But this is like very complex, right? Because like body measurements, while very common in sewing, also have a lot to do with like, eating
Right.
disorders and all kinds of
Yeah.
things. And so then there was like, pushback against that, or people using trigger warnings. Like, I'm going to have my measurements and,
Oh, wow.
it's part of
Yeah.
my profile. So I don't, trigger anyone. And like in terms of comparison. And so then people started using various like body specific hashtags. So like I almost always use fat sewing, plus size sewing, and curvy sewing as my
Mm,
hashtags. So people can like find those, and I like follow those. And so my feed is populated with like a
yeah.
variety of bodies that are larger and look similar
Yeah.
to mine, and I can see the patterns they're making, and it's really great. And there was a moment this summer where there were people who felt like in between, right? Somebody who's maybe like a size 12 or 14. They're like, well, I'm not,
Yeah.
I'm not a fat sewist, but I'm not like super thin. And so there's this movement, people calling themselves mid-size. So we're going to
Yeah.
like do a mid-size roundup, of like the sewing of sewists that are making those things.
Mm.
And there was some pushbacks. It's like, what's the point in calling yourself mid-size? Is it because you want to distance yourself from being fat? And
Ooh.
or is it because, like, I mean, I understand you want to find other bodies that look like you, but why can't you just call yourself straight size? Like, what are you gaining by creating this third category that's distanced from being fat?
Yeah. Oh,
And I
that's
don't think there's like a
interesting.
perfect answer to that, but I think this is that same type of thing, right? Where people are like, I just want to find people who look like me so I
Yeah.
can see what they're making. But I also want you to know I'm not fat.
Right, right, right. I will say that I hear the term mid-size way outside of fashion. I just hear it in like body positive spaces, I
Yeah.
guess. I've never even really challenged it. Um, because my understanding is that they don't feel included in straight sizes
Yes.
because they are on the cusp. So it's not so much about distancing as like really wanting that community connection and like validation of being seen for who they are. But I can absolutely see, especially in spaces that are like size dependent, like sewing, that could get complicated. And it's really interesting to think too, like what a wonderful connective intent to post your numbers. And then on the other side, how many people could be looking at that and struggling with whatever
Yeah.
that it, I mean, I would tell people not to post their weight for the same reason, but measurements have a maybe not quite as heavily like emotionally baggaged as our weight, but very
I think
similar.
very few, unless you're making your own clothing, you are probably not as acutely aware of
Right,
your
yeah. You didn't
measurements.
track that your whole life, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man. Okay. So, going back to the pattern thing, I hear a lot of people defending the lack of brands, companies, whatever, having inclusive and accessible clothing by saying that it's not financially feasible for them to do so, that's the reason they don't. And some of this argument seems to be based on the idea that bigger clothes require more fabric, but that seems really ridiculous because if XS to XL can all be the same, like why does it suddenly feel like too much fabric to include now? But what I could see based on what you're saying is that the patterns have to be different above a certain size. So does
It
that
is,
give any kind of legitimacy to this like defense?
unfortunately, yes, it is effectively double the cost.
Wow.
But if you're a small scale ready to wear brand, or even like or a pattern maker, you buy a professional fit mannequin, usually like Albanon, and they range like, a couple $1,000s.
Oh, whoa.
Um, and these are like, they do like 3D scans of like thousands of people, and so it's supposed to be like more realistic how the
Huh.
body is proportioned and where like fat is located and other things. And so if you're serious, you invest in an Albanon form. And
Wow.
if you are making like a large size range, you're going to have multiple Albanon forms. You're going to have, like your size 12 or 8 that you're using for your straight sizes, and you're going to have a size 20 probably that you're using for your plus sizes. And then whenever you're creating a pattern, you have to create two patterns. And so you're doubling the cost of, like, if you're hiring a drafter or a grader to make those
Right.
grade rolls. And so it is unfortunately about double the cost.
Wow.
And I've seen various attempts to deal with that, right? Like companies who say, like, I will release one pattern in this plus size range. I'm going to see how it sells. And if it sells really well, then, I'll make the investment to do it. But the problem is, who's their existing customer base?
Right.
Um, and then they'll come back and say, it just didn't work. It cost twice the money. And we
Right.
sold, so few that it's just, the numbers aren't there. But when you see companies that go in and take it seriously, and they hire fit models, and they hire models for both of them, and they work with like influencers in the community saying, here, I'm going to send you this pattern for free.
Yeah.
I'll pay for your fabric. Would you sew it for us? And actually like invest in the marketing to bring plus size eyes to the product
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
creating, then it can succeed. But so often, you know, a lack of success is tied to a lack of investment on a marketing level.
Right. Which I could imagine, like, I don't know, it feels sort of unforgivable for major brands and companies. Like I'm thinking like, you know, H&M or Forever 21, like you've got plenty of money to invest in all the things. But for smaller businesses or solopreneurs, that is like a tough call. And I could see that getting in the way. Like why people want to toe dip, but then don't get
Yeah.
that payoff, of course.
I mean, it's totally understandable.
Yeah.
And it's like there's not really a perfect solution, right? Because they have to choose to invest in that. And so there have been some companies who said like, we'd like to, but we just can't do it.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm,
and you know, that's hard from an activism standpoint because I have like respect for them as a person individually,
right.
but you know, pushing forward for size inclusion and for the normalization of fat bodies like that is not you're not on brand.
Yeah.
You're not following along with us.
Ooh, especially when you start thinking about a person with size privilege and all of the financial compensation over a
Mhm.
lifetime that goes with that versus a person already in a fat body who has to basically do all of this labor or pay all of this extra money or whatever it is. Like it is the straight sized people who we need to be doing that investment work.
I
I mean,
talked to
that's, yeah.
yeah, I talked to a friend about this recently because she's a pattern designer, great a technical designer for a ready-to-wear brand. And you know, every decision they make is based on how many units they can sell.
Mhm.
And so, you know, they create, say you know, they have a dress and they sell it based on, you know, extra small to 4X or whatever. And they know that they sell most in the large or the extra large. And so they create more units of that. And then it's a bell curve going to the other sizes. And the question is like, are there actually fewer bodies that are wearing like a 3X and a 4X? Are those bodies like discriminated against in terms of their income? And so they're not buying as much clothing as somebody who's
Right.
in a smaller body. And so, you know, they would love to buy your clothes, but they are
Yeah.
the intersection of the fat phobia as it impacts them is just
Mhm.
very complicated. And this is
Ugh.
seen in sewing, like in sewing influencer circles as well, because you know, I make a dress and I'm going to use more fabric.
Yeah.
It is going to cost more money.
Right.
um, and there's not really like, you know, you'll see sometimes people say like, oh, you can make this top using 1 yard of fabric and let's like, you know, 36 inches by however wide the fabric is. And you're like, no, I can't. It takes more fabric. And so, you know, those moments where people think like, obviously, like everyone can do this. You're like, obviously, everyone cannot.
Yeah.
And that's, yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate,
Oh
but
man.
it happens a lot.
So that kind of goes back. I feel like we bounced out of this question pretty quick and got on another topic, but I want to return to it. So the issues facing people in bigger bodies when it comes to trying to find, buy, or even make their own clothes is sometimes the clothes just don't exist, like
Mhm.
in their size, or like it can just literally not exist. That's one thing. You mentioned the slow fashion versus fast fashion thing, which is sort of an ethical issue. So if you're wanting to buy slow fashion and the only clothes that do fit you happen to be fast fashion, that's tricky. But this one also is a pretty big one, which is literally weight stigma means you are likely to make less in a lifetime, being marginalized in terms of job discrimination and having excess sort of fat tax things, you know, sprinkled throughout your whole life, you're going to have less disposable income on average than a straight sized person, which means that affordability is part of the reason too, right? Like access financially.
Definitely. And this is a real issue. So I mean, I grew up, my mom sewed, not really clothing, mostly like, as I like to say, costumes and quilts.
Yeah.
She did Halloween costumes and quilts. And her narrative, and like every other person's narrative of that generation that I know who stopped sewing, is because fabric got so expensive.
Hmm.
And the reason why fabric got so expensive is because clothes got so cheap. Because
Oh,
fast fashion made clothing so cheap to buy
huh.
that you couldn't justify spending money on fabric. And that's still the situation. If you're making your own clothes, you are not like it costs, I could go to Old Navy, I could buy a pair of jeans for like $30. You cannot buy fabric to sew a pair of jeans for $30.
Oh, wow.
Um, and so, you are spending more money, and people have this debate all the time. They get into sewing because they think it's going to be so much cheaper. It's so much
I totally would
cheaper.
have thought that.
It's not cheaper. Well, it's cheaper if what you're comparing it to is like slow fashion prices.
Right, right,
Like
right.
if you're saying I could buy this Eileen Fisher
Uh-huh.
dress for $300, or I could make my own version for $100, then it is
Yeah,
definitely cheaper. But if your point of comparison is I can go to Target and I can buy this dress for
yeah.
$20, you can definitely not sew it for $20.
Right, gotcha.
And so there's a really great fat sewing pattern company, Muna and Broad, who only make sewing patterns for fat bodies. And it's because the two founders, it was like impossible to buy clothing in their size that use natural fibers. You could only buy
Mm,
clothing that came in synthetic fibers. And they're like,
sure.
synthetic fibers are not my jam. Like for ethical reasons,
Yeah.
for like sweating reasons, like I would prefer natural fibers. And I cannot fucking find underwear that use natural fibers in my size. And
Um,
so they had to go and create an underwear pattern so they could make,
right,
underwear and natural fibers that fit them. And so this like, and who, no one wants to make their own underwear. Like I have
right.
no, that brings no pleasure in life to do. um, it's like, but it just doesn't
Yeah.
exist
Mm-hmm.
in a product that I want on my body. And so I have to create it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that makes so much sense. Also, I am wishing I could remember the name of this woman's account that I love, but there's there's a woman who has a fat body and does all of these remakes of TikTok trends of like skinny girls being like, just wear a thong as a bralette or whatever it is, and she will like do all of them. And it's just so delicious and like funny. And she's just so wonderful. And like basically, this idea that when we think about trends, it's always it's the if I can do it, anyone can do it. And like maybe up to a certain point, but then it gets pretty ridiculous pretty quickly.
I
Yeah.
mean, it definitely does. And then also things like something that drives me absolutely insane are tapered pants. So often you'll
Mm.
see, because there's an illusion involved with like the creation of a tapered leg that happens when you're in a fat body, because the taper needs to be more extreme. My ankle is not like my ankle is probably not that much larger than your ankle. But my thighs are. And so there is like a more
Huh.
extreme taper that needs to happen. And so what you'll see often in pants or patterns that have like a tapered leg, it looks like a straight leg on a fat body because they don't take into account
Oh,
like it's a more severe angle that happens there.
right.
And so, there are things that they think like, oh, this will look the same on every body. And you're like,
Yeah.
actually, that straight leg is a wide leg on me. I need to have like some tapering in the leg for it to have the illusion that you have there.
I feel like that brings such a like nuanced fashion uh consciousness into it too. It's not just like the drafting of patterns, size translation, like all that stuff feels, almost like academic, but literally you're also talking about translating style and trend to give the same vibe
Mm-hmm.
and what has to happen to give the same vibe on different body sizes.
Yeah.
Like
It's,
there's a lot. I mean, I certainly have never thought about any of this before, but like there's a lot there that a person would have to know to be able to do that kind of a job. So it makes a lot of sense that like people, if they don't learn this in school or wherever, they got educated, that this would be completely missing.
well, even, I mean, just like I mentioned previously, like, just having like fat bodies present in these spaces, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you have to think, I talked about the investment in getting like a fit mannequin that they're using to create patterns. It's like, these schools don't even have like the plus size mannequin, right? Like,
Wow.
so it's not like anyone's given an opportunity to test this out unless it's there's someone in their life, that they're making
Right.
this for. And fashion doesn't present itself as like a fat positive space where you'd be
Right.
like, I'm going to go to school to become a fashion designer. And then, so it's just, it's a chicken and egg
Yeah.
situation to some extent.
And I think, like, of all the fashion rules that everybody learns, and particularly for women, it's usually about like highlighting your assets and hiding your flaws. Like, there are, infinitely more for women in fat bodies because,
Mhm.
so shameful, must hide everything, must, camouflage, whatever. So I also can't think of a lot of people in bigger bodies who would jump at the opportunity to like try on a fun piece of clothing that's been translated into their size necessarily, because it's not what they've learned is for them.
Yeah, exactly. Why would they expose themselves to that?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I think I mentioned this to you. So there's a or maybe not this portion of it. There's I probably take a photo of myself every single day, like in the mirror. This is what I'm wearing today, or
Yeah,
like
yeah.
as I'm
Outfit of the
making
day.
things. Um, and every May it's like the month for Instagram sewist. It's called
Oh.
Me Made May. And the woman who started it is like a straight size sewist. And it was to try to incorporate things that she had made more frequently into her wardrobe. And so, like, I'm going to pledge during May that I'm going to try to wear something every day that I made,
Hmm.
or, do some mending on the things that I made that
Yeah,
fell out
yeah.
of my closet or whatever. And that's great, totally awesome. So when I was a little baby sewist, I like saw Me Made May and was like, oh, I totally want to do this. And when I, initially had a photo taken of me every single day, it was really jarring to see my body every single day because you don't look how you imagine yourself every day,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And I definitely caught myself in moments where I wanted to like edit the photo, right? So I look
Yeah.
different or it was a different angle, find like something better because like, do I really look like that?
Yeah.
And what it's become for me as a yearly practice and really like a daily practice is it neutralizes the alienation you can feel when you see an uncurated photo of your body and you go, that's the back of my arm. Like, that's what that looks like. Why has no one ever
Yeah.
told me that that's like what the back of my arm looks like?
Right.
And it becomes like completely normalized. And so, and I love that about
Yeah.
this choice to take a photo of myself every day. And now I can see a photo that I did not curate. And I'm like, oh, yeah,
Yeah.
that's my body.
Yeah. As you can probably imagine, I deal with people with photo anxiety and body image issues all the time. It's such a massive trigger point for a lot of people. And it's tricky where someone is on the journey and just like what's going on for them personally can have a major impact on whether things like gazing at yourself more often, taking pictures of yourself to normalize is going to have a positive impact or a negative impact.
Yeah.
But I feel like when someone's ready, even if it's super uncomfortable, it can be absolutely magical and healing, like what you're saying, because it just gives you familiarity. And a lot of that weirdness that people experience is like, just we don't see we don't see ourselves from the same angles we see everybody else, right? So it's like
Yeah.
jarring, confusing. Plus photos, it totally depends on a million things, angles, lighting, pose, whatever. So I feel like that familiarity can be so healing, but also I'm very aware that it is not appropriate for everyone as a default practice.
Well, and part of why I think it is so healing for me is that being part of like the fat sewing community, my consumption of fat bodies is so normalized that I
Mm,
see people, constantly sharing something that they made or how they
yeah,
styled it for the day. And that's just like my normal media feed is seeing people in bodies similar to mine, larger than mine, smaller than mine. But
yeah,
like, I think there was a moment where it was called like, fatifying your feed, so that
yeah,
the messages that you're seeing are not constantly, of
yeah,
these of bodies that are that dissimilar from yours.
totally. Yeah, I feel like diversifying the feed is good for everyone, point blank. If you're going to be on social media, definitely do that. Um, but what I love about the normalization process you experienced with the photos is that it was done for a higher purpose. It wasn't like because you wanted to track your weight. or something like that, you know? It was to share these clothes you made with a community of people who want to see it. Like, I
Mhm.
feel that that has something even healthier bubbling around it as opposed to just tracking, you know?
Oh yeah, I'm not tracking. I'm tracking like
Yeah.
this is the clothes, and then I go back and I look through them. And I'm like, oh, I really wore that shirt. I wear that shirt a lot. I should make another one of those shirts.
Right.
Or
Just
like
data.
they essentially were like, wow, I never wear this. Like maybe I should get rid of it. It's never entered into my daily wardrobe.
I love it. It's like market research, but you're your own market.
I am a market, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. I do look back and I'm like, wow, I wear that shirt a lot. Or
Oh
help
man.
me discover like new colors and
Yeah.
various things.
So something that I love about your Instagram feed is you do wear a lot of colors. It makes me very happy. I know you live in California, so
Mhm.
somehow that seems to make more sense to me versus East Coast somehow feels drearier and more black. But did you always wear color, or is that something that you've had to like unlearn, relearn, challenge yourself?
It's a good question. So I definitely, was taught that I should wear like black, right? And I was in academia, people were black a lot there.
Yeah, yeah.
And when I started making my own clothes, I was like, there's no joy in black. I want to wear clothing and like make clothing that brings me joy. And what
Yeah.
brings me joy is like colorful prints and patterns, things that I cannot buy clothing in my size.
Right.
And so if I'm going to put the time in, I'm going to do it like and make things that I love and make me happy. And that is not black. So
Right.
like I don't own black shoes. I don't have when I had to go to a funeral last year and I was like, do I have a black dress? Like, what am I going to wear? Um,
Uh-huh.
and because there's so much color and I do love that. And I do get a lot of people commenting on that because it's definitely breaking one of those fat rules that you're supposed to wear like
Mm.
slenderizing colors and things that minimize all of those.
Joyless.
Yeah. um and when I look at I don't have that much like ready to wear in my closet any longer, but when I look at it, it is stuff like that that doesn't bring
Yeah.
any sense of joy.
So I spent a decade in New York City, and for a while, like 99% of my wardrobe was black and gray. Like that was it. And so since leaving, like 8 years ago now, it's been a slow process of integrating color back in. And I feel like I'm not drawn to patterns so much, but I feel like the bright color aesthetic also makes me feel a lot of joy. So I feel a lot of joy when I just like looked through your posts. I was like,
Dopamine
oh, this
dressing.
feels good. I
Yeah.
love it.
It's dopamine dressing for sure.
Dopamine dressing.
um
Yes,
and that's like
totally.
a little side movement. Also black
Yeah.
is not fun to sew. It's really not fun to sew.
Why?
um Sort of like all blacks are not made equal. So having like blacks that match like thread color and various things.
Oh,
And then I mean it is an interesting thing. Like I make clothes for myself, I make clothes for my body that I wear. I also make clothes like part that I share, right? In Instagram. And it is impossible to photograph black clothing well.
oh.
Like if I because I often want to show the details of what I did,
Yeah,
right? And so I had somebody I knew made like a pair of black jeans recently, and she was like, I don't even know why I'm taking photos of them because like it's not like
right.
you can see any of the details on these black jeans.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Yeah.
But
Um,
I have an uncle who went one time to New York City, also from California. And I remember he came back. He's like, God, I gotta get some black shoes. Like, what am I doing wearing brown shoes? So, maybe it is maybe a Californian thing that we just wear black less. But I mean,
maybe.
yeah.
I've had to actively, it's like I have a ban the last couple of years, a complete ban on black. I cannot buy any more black. However, I am constantly like looking at things and going, "Ooh, I love that," like adding to cart and then being like, Jesse, it's black. Like it's hard. It's a hard thing to break.
Yeah.
Um, what kind of feedback do you get for breaking this joyless, all all dark rule for people in bigger bodies?
I get a lot. I mean, so I think I mentioned to you that like Instagram gives you statistics on like where your
Yeah.
followers are. Melbourne, Australia. That's my like number one city.
Wow.
2% of my followers are in Melbourne. it also breaks it down, like gender and age, and like 98% of my followers are women. If it's like
Mm,
a male identifying follower, I
right.
probably know them personally,
Right.
who's there. And so I have a lot of women reaching out to me on a regular basis, like saying, I didn't think I could wear that. It's so great to see you wear that.
Mm,
Or, like, or those, I had an outfit the other day that like broke all the fat dressing rules, where I wore like a knit pencil skirt and a cropped sweater and an oversized jacket and like socks. And so like, I was breaking my long leg
yeah, yeah,
line.
yeah.
I was wearing, a skirt that showed my stomach. I, had an oversized jacket that made me look
Yeah.
larger. Like, and at first I said something like, I feel like I'm breaking a lot of rules today. And I had people say, like, I don't see any, like, what rules are you breaking? And so I broke them down, like, these are the rules I'm
Yeah,
breaking.
yeah,
And the response was like, oh, I've internalized those rules so much that
yeah,
I didn't even think of them as rules, because they're just like absolutes, right? In terms of dressing.
yeah,
And it's love, and it's really lovely for me and affirming to get like that type of feedback.
yeah. So nowadays, if anyone uses the words I can't wear or I have to wear about anything ever, I'm like immediately my little, spidey senses go off and I'm like, tell me more. Where did you learn that? What is that based on? Because I just think it's so interesting. But for sure, even coming to grips with my own internalized rules took years. And I'd be like, I'm finally free of them. And then I'd run into a new one like, oh, I can't wear blazers because they make me look frumpy or something. And I would just be like, not you again. Like, I thought we cleared all these out. There's so many rules that get stuck. And until you actively notice and challenge them, they're just in there.
They're just in there, and it's also hard to know where like preference and action, like a
Yeah.
rule, are. So before I made my own clothing, I think I never wore pants. I think I owned like two pairs
Mm,
of pants. I couldn't find pants in my size, and that had happened for so long that I'd like stopped looking. and
sure.
and so it's like, and so I wore dresses and skirts, and you're like, and then I started making my own clothes, make a lot of pants. It's like, did I actually not like wearing pants, or was it that I just couldn't buy them and that they fit?
Yeah.
So like, was there choice involved with this, or it was because of a lack of accessibility?
Right. Totally. Yeah. I
And
mean, I feel
do
this way
fat
about,
bodies really like cold shoulder tops?
oh my God, I just had the thought to ask you. I was like, Jenna, can you speak to the question of plus size bodies and fun sleeves, please?
Not my
Why?
style. Personally, I've never owned a cold shoulder top. So it's those types of things where you're like, is that, do I actually like that, or is it just
Right.
all that is available?
Oh my God. I think about this a lot with gender expression stuff. Like, I don't know what I like or how I want to express myself and my gender because I was never given any sense that I was allowed to pick from both aisles. You know what I mean? So, like, I just have no concept of masculine clothing on me. I wore a night the night I met you, I was wearing a suit for the first time and I was like euphoric, but I felt going in like I might hate this. I might like feel uncomfortable all night because until you try stuff, until it's accessible, until you have the option, it's just a nothing thing in your head. You don't get to have an opinion on it even. Do you like
Well, this
pants? Who
is,
knows? There are none.
yeah,
Like
exactly. I don't know if I like pants. I think the hard part about being, even like, about sewing, and I mentioned at the beginning that kind of like how I got into sewing has to do with slow fashion and
yeah.
not wanting to buy fast fashion. And it's not like I can run out and go buy like a style that I see and just try it. Like, I have to
Right.
make it to try
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Um, and I used to feel really guilty that I would make these clothes and like I wouldn't wear them because it didn't like fit into my
Mm,
style or whatever. And it recently occurred to me, it's like, well, no, somebody else can just go to the store and go in the dressing room and experience if it works or not. But I
yeah.
have to put in like the investment of time and material in order
Right.
to like test it out. So don't feel guilty, Jenna, if it doesn't work out.
Right. Oh man. I mean, it's kind of like if you like invest a bunch of ingredients in a recipe that goes wrong. Like it can be a bummer because you would have liked it to go right, but that's part of the process, part of the journey. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to ask was, I know that you have a daughter, 3-ish.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you make clothes for her. And I was just gonna
Mhm.
ask, like, what is that experience like? Is it
Rejection.
something, what is it?
Rejection.
Oh no. I was gonna say, how much does she participate in that with you? Like making
Yeah.
requests.
So, I mean, 3-year-olds are fickle creatures. And so often, and they're very literal, extremely literal. And so I'll like show her, and she's very, like refuses to wear pants, only wears dresses. They have to twirl well. They have to have long sleeves. And so like in the winter, I just stock up on long sleeve dresses that twirl well because you can't buy them in the summer.
Mhm.
And I sometimes she'll see a dress or see some fabric and say like that she wants me to make her something. And then I make it for her. And then she's like, no, it's too grippy. It's too like it doesn't twirl very well. So it's a lot of rejection and
Oh my gosh.
sometimes acceptance. But it's interesting because she like, she only wears like basically tutus. And that's her aesthetic.
And I love that. Also, I feel like that speaks to something that gets like worn out of us or stamped out of us as we get older, which is the somatic experience of clothing. Very similar to how I think like a lot of girls and women are conditioned to think of sex as like a visual presentation for your partner. I think that we think of clothing as a visual presentation for the world. But when you're little, you're still in touch with the fact that it's on your body, it's touching you, and it is a somatic experience. And I feel like in my more recent years, I've returned to that, being like, I am a sensitive, like to touch person. If there are tags in my shirt, I am going to be so distracted. Like, oh, soft fabrics, things that move well. It's such
The
a
one pair
pleasure.
of underwear that don't give her a wedgie and that's all she wears. I mean,
Yeah.
like the sensory is very important for her and
Yeah.
like what she can do in those clothes. Like if she can
Oh,
twirl well, then it is
right.
accepted.
I love
She will
that.
put on a dress and spin, and if it does not twirl well, it is immediately rejected.
Fail. Amazing. Okay, so if you could speak to a listener who is hearing all of this and maybe curious to sew or not sure if there's a space for them in this world, what kind of advice would you give?
The best advice is to find a sewing friend. Can be like in real life, or there's probably someone
Yeah.
somewhere. Because it is a hobby, an activity that does require like a fair amount of investment from like a sewing machine, um,
Yeah.
fabric, patterns, materials, like learning those skills. And so if you team up with somebody that you can decide like if that's an investment you want to make. And then even if I have plenty of people who follow me on Instagram who do not make their own clothing, and are always like, if only I could make my own clothes, make me something, Jenna. And I'm like, no, I don't make things for other people. But but I think,
You
it
could start an
can,
inclusive line.
yeah. It can be, just dipping your toes into that world.
Yeah.
Like I said, fat sewing is a great hashtag to check out to just see like fat bodies in clothing that they're able to make for themselves, and that are like, maybe they're following trends that they see that they can't buy in their
Yeah.
size, or they're creating their own, aesthetic of clothing. And it's a great community and a lovely like place to be.
I love that. And where can people find you if they're listening and want dopamine, representation, fun stuff?
I am at the lady who lunches.
Awesome. Anywhere else? Website or anything?
I have a website that I
Pretty
never
much just
update.
Instagram.
So
Okay. Everyone, you absolutely should go follow Jenna. Even if you, like me, know nothing about sewing, the clothes are joyful. I don't know, the body acceptance in that space. Like, I don't know if you identify with body neutrality or not, but it feels that way to me. Feels
yeah,
very body neutral. Um, and it's great. So thank you so much, Jenna, for being here. And everyone, I will catch you next week.
thanks so much.
Hi everyone, I'm Jessie Nealand. I just want to take a moment to thank you for watching this video. I put out new episodes of my podcast every Tuesday, so be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so that you don't miss those, and feel free to leave me a comment. If you are looking for more information about body neutrality or you want to work with me, you can always find me at my website, jessienealand.com, or you can purchase my book, Body Neutral, A Revolutionary Guide to Overcoming Body Image Issues, wherever you buy books, ebooks, or audiobooks. We can also connect on Instagram or TikTok. My handle is Jessie Nealand. And I make this podcast for free and without any sponsors or ads. So if you want to support my show, you can use the Patreon link in the show notes, and know that your support is always very much appreciated. Lastly, thank you to my brother, Jason Nealand, for creating the music that plays at the beginning of the show. And thank you for listening, learning, and moving toward personal and collective body liberation.